And if those of you that are going to state drama, we'll record the review and anything else you need to know, okay? All right, we're kind of backing up, and with the big controversy right now is that Texas officials want the autopsy done in Texas, and Roy Kellerman, the head of the President's Secret Service detail, does not. And again, the reason he wants to get the President's body back to Washington, and it really doesn't have a lot to do with the autopsy. It has to do with the fact that he's got to get Lyndon Johnson somewhere where it's secure, because he's going to become the next President of the United States. And he knows that Lyndon Johnson is not going to go back to Washington without Mrs. Kennedy, and he knows that Mrs. Kennedy's not going back to Washington without her husband's body. So an autopsy is going to take time. They're just not going to do it. So like I said yesterday, we got Secret Service agents drawing guns. We got cussing beyond belief and yelling, okay, right in front of Mrs. Kennedy, which is kind of embarrassing. And finally, the man that comes in and makes the decision that they're going to take the President's body back to Washington, D.C. is going to be Kenneth O'Donnell. And how Kenneth does that is he's got to come up with some sort of a proposal that will be accepted by both sides. So again, to settle the heated discussion between Parkland Hospital doctors and the Kennedy camp, O'Donnell makes a proposal. Now here's his proposal. Admiral George Berkeley, who's on your ID sheet, is President Kennedy's personal physician, and he was on the trip with the President to Dallas. Okay? Again, Admiral George Berkeley, who's on your ID sheet, was the President's personal physician, and he was on the trip to Dallas. Okay? And the deal that Kenneth O'Donnell made is that the President's body would be taken back to Washington, D.C. for autopsy under the caveat that the body would never leave Admiral Berkeley's side the entire time. Once they got that body on the airplane, Admiral Berkeley would sit next to the casket and would never leave his side the entire way back to Washington. Now why is that acceptable? Because what's the concern on the part of the people that want to give the autopsy? That it's not altered, that you know, the President's body is always accounted for, so nobody could go in and alter it. Whether it's the President or anybody else, the autopsy has to be done, you know, securely, okay? So again, O'Donnell states, how about if Admiral George Berkeley never leaves the President's body the entire trip until we get back to Washington, D.C. If you agree to that, then we'll take the President's body. Well, they were considering that, they were talking about it, and O'Donnell turned to Agent Clint Hill, who's had quite a day here, and asked him to go get a casket for the President. So after O'Donnell makes this proposal on how the President's body is going to get back to D.C., he then turns to Secret Service Agent Clint Hill and asks Clint Hill to get a casket for the President's body. So Hill called the local mortuary there in Dallas and asked him to deliver the best casket they had to Parkland immediately. Okay? So again, O'Donnell asked Secret Service Agent Clint Hill to obtain a casket for the President's body. Hill then calls a local mortuary there in Dallas and says, send me the best casket available and get it to Parkland Hospital immediately, which they did. Yeah?
Is it like rumored that they got it from the hospital?
The what?
The casket?
No, it did not. That's not true.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Okay. Now, once he was assured the President's body was being taken back to Love Field, who departed under protection of the Secret Service back to Air Force One? Lyndon Johnson. Okay? So the casket arrives. The President's body is placed in the casket. Nobody really agreed at Parkland on the medical term side of O'Donnell's proposal. That's what he proposed. Nobody really took to that. And so basically the President's body was forcefully taken from the hospital. They were just moving people out of the way, running over people with the casket on the gurney. So the proposal was made. Dallas medical officials really didn't buy much of it. Some did, some didn't. Dr. Earl Rose never did. And so really in essence, once the president's body was put in the casket, it was forcefully taken out of the hospital and put,
But
it
he was
died.
all like bloody and stuff still, he wasn't like washed or like,
They just wrapped him up in a sheet and took him.
wow.
Yeah, okay? Any questions on that subtopic then? He's in the hearse and he's heading to Love Field, okay? That'll take us to I think our final subtopic of this test material, which is departure back to Washington, D.C. So, as I mentioned, the president's body's loaded in the hearse and it's taken off from Parkland heading where? To Love Field, okay? So departure back to Washington, D.C. The hearse arrived at Love Field at 2:15 p.m. The hearse arrived from Parkland Hospital to Love Field. It arrived at 2:15 p.m. Now, prior to that hearse arriving at Love Field, they took 2 rows of seats out of Air Force One to make room for the president's coffin. They obviously weren't expecting and taking a coffin back. And if you've been on an airplane, there's not probably a lot of extra room for a coffin. So they were forced to take 2 rows of seats out of Air Force One to make room for the president's coffin. Why was that? Why did they take 2 rows of seats out? So he could take. Well, that wasn't agreed upon. It was, but it wasn't. No, the Secret Service wasn't going to have the president's body below the aircraft like a piece of luggage. They were going to have the body on the airplane dignified. So there's no place for a coffin on the airplane. Could they put it underneath the airplane with the luggage? Well, sure they could, but that wasn't going to happen. So they took the 2 rows of seats out. What's that? Yeah, so they took the 2 rows of seats out to make room for the coffin. Now the coffin that they got was very heavy, and it was loaded onto Air Force One with a lot of Kennedy's entourage. His personnel, political personnel, were the ones that were loading it onto the airplane. It was very heavy. And actually it was too wide to fit through the doors of Air Force One after they went and got it. Okay, so picture this. They're unloading the hearse. They're taking it up the stairway to Air Force One. Basically, the people carrying this heavy casket with the president is his entourage. And then they get to the door of the airplane and the thing's too wide to fit through. Well, that's, you know, I don't know. Do you do that? Do you turn it sideways and take it in? So what they did is basically the problem, the width, was the handles. So basically what they did is they broke the handles of the casket so they could get it in the door, because, and Shana makes a great point, they're not going to tip the thing like this and have the president's body flopping all over inside the casket. That wouldn't be dignified. So they basically broke the handles of the casket off so they could get it through the aircraft. This day is a nightmare. Nothing's working very well for them. Okay? Now, once they got inside the plane, they couldn't make the corner because there's a petition there, right? I mean, there always is. And so what they had to do is they had to saw off the entrance, part of the entrance of the plane, so they could take the coffin and make the corner of the airplane to put it in those area where they took the seats out. Because of, well, yeah, I'm telling you, it was quite a mess. Now, think about it. When you get into a plane in D.C., maybe you've been in planes, is there, when you walk in that entrance, is there just a wide open place to go? No, you got to walk through it. It's about this wide. So they had to take that entire wall out of the entrance, saw it, while these guys are holding the casket, like Shana said, and they had to get, it was just a mess. It was just an absolute mess. Well, as soon as they got the president's body in, General Godfrey McHugh, who's on your ID sheet, who was a military aide to President Kennedy, insisted that the plane take off immediately. So as soon as they got the president's body in the plane and settled, General Godfrey McHugh, who was one of Kennedy's military advisors, ordered the plane to take off immediately. So again, after the president's body was secured in the aircraft, General Godfrey McHugh, who was a military aide to Kennedy, insisted that the plane take off. Okay, there were 3 reasons why he was so insistent on that plane taking off immediately. Anybody want to guess what they might have been? Safety concerns, you know, that there might be a conspiracy, you know. Safety concerns. Not for Johnson though, just keep that in mind. Safety concerns, they might be gonna kill all the president's entourage, and maybe Mrs. Kennedy, they don't know. So safety concerns is one reason why he insisted. Another one, anybody want to guess?
The body would be good faster.
Get the body back as soon as possible.
Well, kind of, but it's got a couple different things you might not think of. Who might be wanting that plane to take off pretty damn quick? Jackie. Jackie's request to let's go. Okay, Jackie's continued request to let's get off the ground here. She had had enough of Dallas. And the third reason, which you probably wouldn't pick up, is the plane had been basically running for everything to work correctly, because you have to have security, you can't stop the plane if something happens. So from the time they flew into Love Field till now, that plane had been running. So what was the interior like? Hot, very hot. People were very uncomfortable. So the three reasons that General McHugh wanted Air Force One to take off immediately as soon as the president's body got on was safety concerns, Jackie Kennedy's repeated request to take off, and the plane's interior cabin was incredibly warm and uncomfortable. Now, why would it be so hot? Why wouldn't they have air conditioning units hooked up to it? They normally do. Well, the problem is, when the plane is on alert and has to take off at a moment's notice in case there's a problem, like there is right now, it takes time to disconnect that air conditioning thing. So when the president's plane ran that whole time, they didn't put the air conditioning on it because it would take too long in case of emergency to get unhooked, which is exactly what happened here, okay? Now, the plane sat there and sat there and sat there and sat there, and finally McHugh got irritated and he went and asked pilot James Swindoll why the plane had not taken off. What's the deal here? Okay? So, when the plane had not taken off, McHugh went directly to pilot James Swindoll and asked why the plane had not taken off. What was his response? What? Well, kind of. Not exact. Nobody told him to depart yet. Who's the man that's going to tell him to depart in Swindoll's mind? Who's the guy who? One more time.
Air traffic.
No.
Kennedy?
No. Johnson. McHugh didn't even care if Johnson was on the airplane. They assumed remember he flew into Dallas flew into San Antonio before Kennedy? Well, they assumed Johnson was going to go back on his own plane. They weren't concerned about him at all. They wanted to get off the ground. Well, Johnson was on the plane and he hadn't told the pilot to take off yet. McHugh didn't even know Vice President Johnson was on the airplane. Honest to God, that's how hectic it was. He had assumed, like I mentioned, that Johnson would fly back in his own plane like he did when he came. What was Johnson's delay? Why was he not taken off immediately?
He wasn't sworn in.
He was not sworn in. Johnson wanted to be sworn in as president on Air Force One before they departed. He did not want a leaderless country. Okay? Probably a good move, something he'll be highly criticized for, especially from the Kennedy camp afterwards, which we'll talk about. So Johnson's the ones that delaying the takeoff because he wants to be sworn in as President of the United States before he does. Now, who do you think that he would call to try to get their approval to have this done? Think about this before you answer. Who would Johnson call to see if they thought it'd be okay if he was sworn in on the airplane before they left rather than when they got back?
Attorney General
Robert Kennedy. So Vice President Johnson called Robert Kennedy back in Virginia to talk about the oath of office. And he asked Bobby who could administer the oath and what the constitutional requirements were concerning the oath of office. So Johnson has made contact with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, unfortunately the brother of the slain president, and asked him a temperamental question, basically, who can administer the oath and what does the Constitution say about the oath of office, okay? Because everybody's in kind of a bit of a panic, okay? So he calls Bobby Kennedy. Well, when Bobby Kennedy visits with Vice President Johnson, he said he would check on it and call him back. Now, what does this tell you? Lyndon Johnson wants what from Bobby Kennedy to be sworn in? His approval or permission. There's no question that he is wanting the president's brother's approval to be sworn in. He wants it to be Bobby's ID So idea, so he doesn't get criticized in the end, right? There's no doubt about it. So there was little doubt that Vice President Johnson wanted Bobby's permission to take the oath of office in Dallas. Okay. Well, it was a tough deal. I mean, if it wasn't the president's brother, maybe not, you know what I mean? But it was a tough deal. Now, Johnson insisted to the day he died that it was the idea from the Attorney General to take the oath. He really wanted the decision to be Bobby's. He even stated to the Kennedy personnel on the aircraft, he said, quote, "Bobby wants me to take the oath in Dallas." So Lyndon Johnson really wanted this to be Bobby's idea, because it, as Emily said, it was seemed a little insensitive. Later, Robert Kennedy insisted it was Johnson's idea. So we have a conflict here. And you can imagine when the Kennedy supporters found out that when Johnson says, "Bobby wants me to take the oath in Dallas," and later Robert Kennedy says, "Well, that's not true, it was Lyndon that wanted to take the oath," they were upset with him. And they never did like him anyway. Okay, so he took a lot of criticism. So Johnson assumes that he's gotten Bobby's permission to be sworn in. So what he does is he calls a guy by the name of Irving Goldberg. Now, Irving Goldberg was a close friend and political advisor of Lyndon Johnson's, and he asked Goldberg who could swear him in, who around the area could come to the plane and swear him in. So Johnson, after obtaining, in his mind, permission from Bobby Kennedy to take the oath, calls Irving Goldberg, who was a friend and political advisor, and says, "Hey, who in the area can swear me in?" Well, Goldberg didn't know that, so who might he call? Somebody of importance, like a United States attorney? So Goldberg calls U.S. Attorney Barefoot Sanders and asks him who can administer the oath to the president. This is a brand new catch right here, by the way. This is Barefoot Sanders right here with President Kennedy, and this is a letter signed by him. He was a U.S. attorney at the time, and Goldberg called Barefoot Sanders and said, "Who can swear in Lyndon Johnson as president?" Well, Barefoot Sanders looked into it and he informed Goldberg that a federal judge could administer the oath. So when Goldberg told Johnson that a federal judge could administer the oath, what did Johnson tell Goldberg to find? A federal judge to swear him in. So picture that in your mind, that's what's going on. Irving Goldberg was called by Vice President Johnson, who calls Barefoot Sanders, U.S. Attorney. Barefoot Sanders tells Goldberg that a federal judge can swear the president or vice president as president. Goldberg then informs Johnson, then Johnson tells Goldberg, "Go find me a federal judge." In the meantime, both Lyndon Johnson and his wife Lady Bird Johnson went to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin in the airplane to express their sorrow, to talk with her. So while they're waiting for this federal judge to come, the vice president and his wife, Mrs. Johnson, go to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin in the airplane to express their sorrow. Now this is kind of an interesting synopsis. Mrs. Johnson noticed that Jackie's dress was still stained with blood. Her right glove had the president's blood on it. Her nylon stockings were covered with the president's blood, brain matter still, etc. And so Mrs. Johnson, who was a very nice woman, suggested to Mrs. Kennedy asked if she might want to change and clean up prior to Vice President Johnson being sworn in. And she didn't do it meanly, and Mrs. Kennedy didn't take it meanly. But Mrs. Kennedy was determined. She refused to change her clothes and stated to Mrs. Johnson, quote, "I want them to see what they've done to Jack." She would not change her clothes. She wore them all the way back to Washington, D.C. And again, of course, you saw the video on the pink suit and what became of it. But anyway, according to Mrs. Johnson's, Jackie's dress was stained with blood along with her right glove and nylons. Mrs. Johnson suggested to Mrs. Kennedy that she might want to clean up prior to the swearing in of the vice president, and she refused, stating, "I want them to see what they've done to Jack." So it's a little bit of an interesting scenario. Finally, Sarah T. Hughes, a federal judge. Right here she is. This was a hard autograph to get, by the way. Sarah T. Hughes, who was a federal judge, showed up on Air Force One, and at 2:38 p.m. swore in Vice President Johnson as the 36th President of the United States. So again, Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes arrived at Air Force One at Love Field, and at 2:38 p.m. she swore in Vice President Johnson as the 36th President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy was asked to come to the swearing in, and Kenneth O'Donnell said, "No way." You're putting her through that. Right in front of Mrs. Kennedy, and Mrs. Kennedy politely told Mr. O'Donnell that she would be pleased to be part of it. Okay, that's just how stoic she was. So she's standing there during the swearing in with her blood-stained dress. And I'm going to give you a famous picture here, swearing in, and tell you who all those people are. It's a very famous picture in history. And this is the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson as the 36th President of the United States, with Jackie Kennedy right by his side.
In pictures and stuff, you really can't see the blood and all that.
You can see the darks, it's just kind of dark stain. Okay, if you look on there, it's kind of hard to see it here, but you can, everything with your, Shane is right, everything was filmed in black and white pretty much in those days. And as a result of that, it's hard to tell. Okay? Now, the man that took this famous photograph was Cecil Stoughton. And Cecil Stoughton was a White House photographer. He's the guy that used to sneak in, remember I think I told you that, when Jackie was gone to take pictures of the children, which she didn't like, and she was always scolding Cecil Stoughton for doing that. But anyway, Cecil Stoughton was the White House photographer who took this very famous picture of the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson. He was the first really White House official photographer in our country's history. Now, they've had one ever since, but Kennedy was the first president to have the official White House photographer. Okay? All right, now because I like y'all, instead of having you write all this down, I'm just going to help you out. You promised to study this. Okay, so I'm saving you all kinds of writing here. Because we're going to identify those people in the picture. And rather than have you try to write them down, I'm just going to write them down for you. How about that? But I want you to know who these people are because it's important in history.
Are they all on my,
Yeah, they're on your ID sheet, but these are actually copies of my notes, so if they are underlined and bigger, you know they're on the ID sheet, okay? So let's go through this famous photograph. So all I want you to do is have the photograph in front of you and this handout I just gave you, and you can kind of see who's who. Okay, number one. Everybody find number one in the bottom left-hand corner. Anybody want to guess who that is? Well, you have it. It's Malcolm Kilduff. Remember, Malcolm Kilduff did what? What was his? He was the assistant press secretary that pronounced the Kennedy dead to the press. Well, there he is. And if you look real carefully, right to the left of number 6, do you see something right in front of the mouth? Okay. He made the only audio recording of the event. He held up a dictaphone, which had been on the president's desk on Air Force One, and he was the only man that had recorded that instance, okay? Number 2 in the polka dot top is Sarah T. Hughes. She was the federal judge who swore in Vice President Johnson. Number 3, interesting, if you see him there to the left, that's Jack Valente. I actually have the picture up here with Jack Valente's signature right there. Okay, he was an interesting character and later became pretty famous as a movie person in the movie business. But he served as a liaison with the news media during the president's trip to Dallas. He later became a special assistant, kind of the Kenneth O'Donnell to President Johnson during the time he was president. Okay, that's Jack Valente. After being out of politics, he went into the movie business, made quite a bit of money. Okay, number 4, ironically, is Albert Thomas. That was the congressman whom President Kennedy spoke at his appreciation dinner on November 21st, 63 in Fort Worth, after San Antonio. Space program, Houston. Okay? All right, number 5 kind of hard to see her. She just kind of got her eyes down, see her head kind of looking down. You can see her eyes and her hair. That was Marie Femmer. She was a personal secretary to Vice President Johnson. You kind of see the outline of her head there. Okay. Number 6, standing to the right of Lyndon Johnson is Lady Bird Johnson. And of course, number 7 is Lyndon Baines Johnson being administered the oath of office. And obviously number 8 is Jackie Kennedy. Number 9, and you can kind of just barely see kind of the top of his head. See there? It's right between Johnson's head and Jackie's head. You can just see the top of his head. That was Homer Thornberry. And he was a former congressman from Texas. He was appointed president. He was appointed by President Kennedy to a seat on the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas in 1963. Here's a better picture of him. I got to find you. Right here. Homer Thornberry is this guy right here. And this is right after, or right before, one of the two that he was sworn in. But this is Homer Thornberry right there, his signature. Okay? Number 10, and you can't see her very well. You can just barely see kind of her glasses. You see it? By Jackie's head there. Very, very hard to see. That is Evelyn Lincoln, this lady right here. The secretary right here. Evelyn Lincoln. That's President Kennedy's personal secretary. 11, and you can only kind of see the top of his head and his left eye and ear. That's Roy Kellerman. That was the Secret Service agent in charge of the Dallas detail that insisted the president's body be removed without autopsy. Number 12 was Lem Johns. He was a Secret Service agent that was assigned to Vice President Johnson. This is kind of interesting. Number 13, you can't see her very well. You can just kind of see her eye off the side of that guy in 14. But that was Pamela Tunyer. And she was a personal assistant to Jackie Kennedy, who later was rumored to have had an affair with the president. She kind of came out.
Pamela Turner.
Yep. So unfortunately, that's an unfortunate thing. But she was a special personal assistant to Jackie. But I think the president got maybe a little bit too personal with her. Okay, number 14 is Jack Brooks. Okay, and Jack Brooks was a congressman from Texas who served 42 years in the House. He was in the motorcade during the assassination, so he's very young there, early in his political career, but he ended up serving 42 years in Congress. Unbelievable. Okay, number 15 is Bill Moyers. You can just kind of see the top of his head. He was a journalist and public commentator who served as White House press secretary from 65 to 67. He was also appointed as Associate Director of Public Affairs for the newly created Peace Corps in 1961. And I have a picture, I have a signature of him. He's right back here, and there's his, he signed it and actually put an arrow to his own head. So it's kind of interesting, but that's Bill Moyers. And finally, 16, ironically, and you can only see his right eye kind of on the other side of Johnson's head, or hand, I mean, and that was Jesse Curry, Chief of Police, the Dallas Police Department. This guy right here
He's the one that announced that.
was coming to town. He also was one that drove the lead car. Okay, so that's the people in the famous picture.
Where's Kenneth?
Who?
Where's Kenneth O'Donnell at?
He's not in the picture. He is there, but he's not in the picture. You know where he probably is?
Probably behind.
I know where he is.
He's with the coffee.
He's with the coffin. That's exactly right. Okay, so moving on. At 2:46 p.m., Air Force One departs for Washington, D.C. Saved you a lot of writing. At 2:46 p.m., Air Force One departs for Washington, D.C. And at 3 o'clock, who does President Johnson call and talk to? Back east. No. Back east.
Oh, east.
2:30.
Yeah, at 3 o'clock. 2:46 they depart. At 3 o'clock, who does Johnson call and talk to? No? Maybe somebody else's
That's what I'm saying.
mom or
Kennedy's
dad.
dad.
Kennedy's dad?
Yeah.
Actually, very close. Kennedy's mom, Rose. Because Kennedy's dad is not in very good shape, okay? He's suffered a stroke and he's in tough shape. So
You say at 3.
at 3 p.m., President Johnson calls and talks to Rose Kennedy, the president's mother. Here's the conversation. You don't have to write it down, just listen. Lyndon Johnson says, they get on the phone, he says, Mrs. Kennedy? And Rose Kennedy says, it kind of gives me goosebumps. Mrs. Kennedy says, yes, Mr. President? How about that? Lyndon Johnson says, I wish to God there was something I could do, and I wanted to tell you that we're grieving with you. And Mrs. Kennedy responds, yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know you loved Jack and he loved you. And President Johnson, who was a very stoic man, became very emotional and had to give the telephone to his wife because he couldn't talk to her. Okay? So Lady Bird then says to Mrs. Kennedy, we are glad that the nation had your son as long as it did. And Mrs. Kennedy's response to that was, yes, well, thank you, Lady Bird. Thank you very much. Goodbye. And Lady Bird ends the conversation by saying, love and prayers to all of you. Kind of an interesting conversation. And Mrs. Kennedy was just a stoic. Think of the tragedy she's gone through in her life, and she's got more coming, okay? So, at 6 o'clock, Eastern Standard Time. Now, I want you to note that, because what are all these other times?
Central Standard.
Central Standard Time. So, at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. At 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. Who immediately met Air Force One when the aircraft landed? Immediately. Bobby Kennedy. And I just want you to kind of listen to this, and then you can write down what you want. Robert Kennedy immediately met Air Force One when the aircraft landed, and he boarded the jet and immediately pushed his way to the back of the plane where Jackie was seated. He pushed right by the new president and didn't even acknowledge he was there. I mean, Bobby got on that plane and he headed to Jackie, straight through. He went right by President Johnson, didn't even look up to acknowledge him. Now, Johnson had a plan, because he's a politician, that he and Mrs. Kennedy would exit the aircraft together with the body of the slain president. He thought that's what protocol should have been. Bobby Kennedy was having no part of that. That was a snub that President Johnson would never forget in his life. He would talk about later in life. So Johnson's plan was that Mrs. Kennedy and he, as president, and the body would be taken up together. Bobby Kennedy had no part of it. A lift truck edged up to the open door of the aircraft, and the bronze casket bearing the body of John Kennedy was unloaded. Okay? And I'll show you this on video. But basically, you can see Lawrence O'Brien, you can see Bobby Kennedy, you can see Kenneth O'Donnell, you can see David Towers, all of these guys helping unload the president's body from Air Force One, you know, onto this lift truck. And what a lift truck is, it goes up there, and the back of the truck comes up off the ground, and the casket got put on it, then it went down, then they took it over and put it in an ambulance. Now, where was the body taken, do you think? Anybody want to know? If you look on your ID sheet, maybe look at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And why were they taking it to Bethesda Naval Hospital? For the autopsy. Okay, very good. So, the lift truck comes up to the back of the airplane. It obviously lifts up all of the Kennedy entourage, including David Powers and Kenneth O'Donnell and Lawrence O'Brien and Bobby Kennedy. I mean, it's just a sad sight. They put that coffin on there, it lowers it down, and they put it into the ambulance. Robert and Jackie Kennedy, you can see it very clear, and you'll see the video. Very clear, they get into the ambulance. She's still got the blood-stained socks. You can see them very evident. Stockings, and Bobby Kennedy immediately grabs her, gets her in the ambulance, and they go to Bethesda Naval Hospital for the autopsy. Okay? Now, why was Bethesda chosen? Anybody know? It's a very good. It's a naval hospital, and what was Kennedy in? The Navy. See? That was the president's official hospital during his presidency, because he was a Navy man. Bethesda was his hospital, because it was a Navy hospital. Now, here's poor President Johnson. I mean, he's just left in the aircraft with his wife. They all took off. They didn't even acknowledge he existed. Well, he had made arrangements that there would be a television, which he needed to do. He needed to address the nation. So there's a microphone and TV crews out there on the landing spot at Andrews. So at 6:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Lyndon Johnson gave his first public speech as President of the United States on the tarmac, so to speak, on the ground at Andrews Air Force Base in a makeshift media deal. So at 6:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Lyndon Johnson gave his first speech as President of the United States. This is what he said. Yes?
Did he have somebody write that speech, or did he just kind of say stuff?
You know, I'm guessing that Jack, I don't know this for sure, but I think Jack Valenti probably, who was his special, I think somebody helped him with that as he planned as they flew back. He didn't say much for probably thinking 2 hours or so about what he was gonna say on the way back, if you can imagine that. But anyway, this is all he said. He stepped the podium and he said the following, quote, "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's." And then he became the president and he went to the White House. Isn't that incredible? So, there's the end of that. So what we're gonna do is tomorrow, I'm going to give a test review, and then I'm gonna show you a movie called Where Were You the Day JFK Died? But I've almost got second thoughts on that. I'm gonna show you a video called Parkland. And it's all the events that went on at Parkland Hospital. It is really kind of gory, but it's very good and gives you an idea of what went on at Parkland Hospital, okay? I'll show you that. And then Monday we will start this other video, Where Were You, have the quiz Tuesday and move on. So you are done with notes and you are done with tests. You still have a biography that's due if you haven't turned it in. You still have that assignment that's due if you haven't turned it in. Both due the 17th, which is the day of our semester exam, and we will, on the 17th, watch a video which will take the entire semester exam period called The Kennedy Detail. It is incredible. It is incredible. Okay? Yes? Well, go ahead. Yeah. Any questions?
This is M.A. McDonald, right?
There's one who's Monday.
He was talking about when, like, first told,